8 o'clock. There's still a few people moving in here, but I would ask you to please get settled so we can get started today. I'm Bill Sullivan. I'm the moderator of this session, the second one in the 2024 OSHER at Dartmouth Summer Lecture Series. And I'd like to welcome all of you in the audience here at the Lebanon Opera House, as well as those who are attending via YouTube, to today's session that will focus on autocracy's rise, sharp power, and the growing threat to democracy, a very critical subject. Before we proceed further, I'd like to ask all of you in the house here today, please shut off your cell phones. Make sure that they're either silenced or shut off. Thank you. Now, let me thank our sponsors for this year's Summer Lecture Series. They are the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law Estate Planning and Settlement, Doyle and Lohman Wealth Management Group, Kendall at Hanover, the Village at White River Junction, and the sponsors for today's session, the Commonwealth Financial Group, Mascoma Bank, Mariner Wealth, and also in participating with us today in this series will be other OSHER programs, fellow OSHER programs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, the University of Athens in Georgia, and the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia. Our featured speaker this morning is Christopher Walker. Chris is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. And prior to this position, he was the Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House. In addition to frequently testifying before various legislative committees and institutes in both the United States and abroad, Chris has co-edited 3 books on authoritarianism, including one published last year, Defending Democracy in the Age of Sharp Power, and he'll show you a copy of that when he comes up here. Chris' focus today will be, as I said, on autocracy's rise, sharp power, and the growing threat to democracy. As you listen to today's session, please write your questions on the index cards you were given when you came in, or if you are attending via YouTube, you can submit your questions using the chat panel to the right of your screen on YouTube. So as you listen today, write your questions down. Those of you here at the Lebanon Opera House, there are 2 boxes where you can do that. One right up here on the front stage and another one in the rear on the center door back there. So write the questions down. We will look at those during the break and then use them for the Q&A session, which will follow Chris's talk. So let me now welcome Chris Walker to address autocracy's rise, sharp power, and the growing threat to democracy. Chris, would you please come in?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. So thanks very much, Bill. I'd like right at the outset to thank Ann Hargraves, Martha Clark, Lisa King, and Sarah Chamberlain, and the entire OSHER staff for the welcome here. It's really a privilege to be here, and I'd like to thank everyone who's here for braving the heat. I thought I might get a break coming from down south up north, but I'm not sure that's in the cards exactly yet. And it's a real privilege to be here. I think the OSHER lecture series, which I wasn't familiar with before, is just a great vehicle for sharing ideas in a public format, something that's, I would say, as needed today in civics context as at any point I can imagine in the recent past. Before I get into my presentation, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about the National Endowment for Democracy, where I work. Very privileged to work there. NED celebrated its 40th anniversary last year. We're a grant-making organization that is unusual in that it's bipartisan and is demand-driven. It focuses on providing support to civil society groups now in about 100 countries around the world who themselves are trying to develop, cultivate, and build more democratically accountable, human rights-friendly environments for themselves. We have 4 partner institutions. This is a reflection of the bipartisan nature of the organization. We have the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is associated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and an organization called the Solidarity Center, which is associated with the AFL-CIO. So the basic premise behind this set of organizations was the U.S. supporting ambitions and aspirations of groups overseas who themselves wanted to develop a more democratic environment. I think it's fair to say that times have changed since NED was first created 40 years ago. Part of my presentation will be a very succinct look at recent history and the trajectory of democracy and freedom over a period of time. It won't be exhaustive, we don't have time for that, but I will try to touch on some aspects of development which I think are particularly important. And some of this is an outgrowth of work that my colleagues and I have been doing for quite some time, looking at some of the challenged assumptions coming out of the end of the Cold War. And so one initiative we undertook, now it's a little over a decade ago we started it, was looking at the ways authoritarian powers were starting to exert influence beyond their national borders. And we had a really wonderful experience gathering a mix of experts who, for example, knew China very well, but then also brought experts who knew Latin America, Africa, other parts of the world well, and brought them together to start talking through some of the, at the time, emerging challenges. That led to the publication of a book that was titled Authoritarianism Goes Global. That was published in early 2016, but was really a reflection of work done in the preceding years. And since that time, I think it's fair to say, if anything, the engine and drivers of authoritarianism in a global context have been even more empowered. So we'll talk about that a little bit more today. My work at NED focuses on the wider world. We support democracy internationally. We don't do that domestically. So I'm taking a wider lens look at the challenges we have, which I actually think are quite relevant to developments we're seeing in other parts of the world, including in what we've often considered to be advanced democracies. I think young democracies are also at great risk today, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the presentation. So I'm starting with a map that my former place of work produces on an annual basis. So Freedom House every year does a very comprehensive look at political rights and civil liberties around the world. They look at every country when they do this. This is a map from 2004, which covers through the end of calendar 2003. And it's a snapshot. It shows conditions as of that date, but I think it's still quite telling in a number of respects. The countries that have the green color are the stronger performers, relatively speaking. The countries that are purple are the weaker performers. That is to say, they don't respect political rights and civil liberties. And the yellow countries are those in the middle. There are gradations within those three colors that are up there, but it gives you a sense of where the world was. And in a way, this period of time, 2004, was a decade and a half after the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall falling down. And so you see, for example, Central Europe, which had been under the subjugation of Moscow during the Cold War period, has moved to the green category at the time. Countries like Venezuela were middle performers. Turkey was in that category, and so forth. And so this was, by and large, a positive story that was an outgrowth of the third wave of democracy coming out of the 1970s, which started with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974. Several things to keep in mind with this map, in particular, at this particular moment in time. This was right on the cusp of the digital revolution, especially with social media. So Google officially came on the scene in 1999, although it really started to get traction in the mid-2000s. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube came on the scene in 2004, 2005, 2006. One can draw their own conclusions on the impact of social media. It's very difficult to demonstrate causality, but the period of time that followed the mid-2000s has been defined as a period of democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. And so at least the correlation between the emergence of social media and democratic challenges seems to be there, and I think it's something to reflect on. So this is a snapshot before the emergence of social media as we know it today. But at the same time, this is really a very good story in terms of where the world was. If we fast forward 20 years, so this is a little bit newfangled, more modern version of the map that my former colleagues at Freedom House produced. It's a much tougher situation. So this is 20 years later. Purple countries are the ones where political rights, civil liberties are not respected. Yellow countries, middle performers, and the green are the ones where, in the main, they are respected more. You can see here, Russia had moved from a middle performing spot to a not free spot, which is duly warranted. I think today we can talk about this a little bit more. The trajectory overall has been quite problematic over time from a democracy point of view. And what I would stress is that many of the countries that had already been considered authoritarian polities, in many respects have become more repressive. And so if you look at the Middle East post-Arab uprisings, virtually all of those countries are more repressive, less open today than they were, say, 12 or 13 years ago, certainly from the 20-year perspective. Russia is more repressive today than it was at that time. China is more repressive today than it was. Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro today is more repressive. And so this is a very tough environment. And this map, I think, again, it's a snapshot taking us through the end of calendar 2023, but gives a sense of where we are today. And so it's really a global picture and global challenge that we're confronting. So some of the things I would stress, and I'll talk a little bit about the graphic on the right, is that over the last 2 decades, dictatorships have actually modernized their repression in many ways. Talk a little bit about this later. Part of this story is what has come to be termed transnational repression. It's part of the outward-facing expression of repression that one could argue that as modern, globalized authoritarian regimes become more repressive at home, they feel more emboldened and empowered to pursue repression abroad. While there are a number of authoritarian powers that one can cite as having reached beyond their borders, being major global influencers, I think China and Russia are in a class of their own. But it's also worth emphasizing that in many democratic systems, broadly defined, the safeguards that have been understood to ensure routine transfers of power and the protection of civil and political rights have been challenged and in many cases eroded. The graphic on the right side of this slide, also drawn from Freedom House data, shows that over effectively a 2-decade period, in each of the years going country by country, declines outstripped improvements over time. And so I used to participate in the production of this work. It's actually quite striking that the kind of systemic, persistent declines have proceeded over such a protracted period of time, and I think it helps explain some of what we're seeing in the bigger picture. So that's a preview and a prelude in a sense. Now I'm going to go into 4 sections. The first one is the most involved, really to talk a little bit about the authoritarian resurgence part of the story of the last quarter century or so. why we've been unprepared for it, what it means in the bigger picture for democratic societies writ large, and then what we can do about it. We'll talk a little bit about sharp power, which is a term that my colleagues and I developed, which was an outgrowth of work that we really started a decade ago, and I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. It was, in a sense, an effort to capture a little more ably the reality that what we were seeing didn't quite feel so soft and didn't seem like soft power in the ways that it was being exerted from some of these repressive regimes. And then not to dwell on the muscles and the unassailability of authoritarian powers throughout the entire presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of these systems, inherent weaknesses, and I think by extension some of the inherent power and benefits and strengths of democracies, and then just briefly touch on some of the things that democratic societies might do to meet the challenge. So I think from the perspective of the early 1990s, it would have been very hard for someone to imagine, maybe even more recently, that we would have a full-blown land war in Europe today. Even if the signs were staring us in the face, because as my Ukrainian friends tell me, Russia didn't invade Ukraine in February 2022. They actually did that when they annexed Crimea and then moved into the Donbass. And we lose sight of that sometimes because we're in an age of information abundance. There's often confusion in the information space. Russia and its adherents go to great lengths to try to suppress the idea that things are happening the way they're happening. But the fact of the matter is we have a full-blown land war today in Ukraine that's now going on 3 years. I think it was also very difficult to imagine in, say, the mid-1990s that China would evolve in the way that it did, because the overarching sense, with the rarest of exceptions, was that China was on a path to modernization, its economy was modernizing, and it would invariably liberalize, even if it might be a step back for a step forward. And that was absolutely the zeitgeist. One of the few observers who took a different tack was an author by the name of James Mann, who wrote a book called The China Fantasy, now almost 2 decades ago. And he happened to be a journalist who lived in China. It was very interesting. So he wasn't a political scientist, he wasn't a scholar of China. He was a journalist, and I think the feeling is that he actually understood in ways that many others didn't, that China might not evolve quite in the way that the conventional wisdom had it at the time. But this is where we are today. And so not only is Russia waging active military warfare on the European continent in Ukraine today, but post-Wagner Group, we have private military companies operating under Russia throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Spanish language media aligned with Russia, Russian state media supported efforts in Latin America are incredibly large and big. It gets very little attention, but if you speak with friends or colleagues who live in Latin America, they'll tell you Spanish language content coming from Russian state media is proliferated throughout the social media space and is seen to have quite significant effect there, even if it can be hard to measure precisely. And I think we can also see in China's case, just to stick with Russia and China, that the subjugation of Hong Kong was not something that was anticipated from the perspective of 20, 25 years ago. I think the overarching wisdom and logic at the time was that because Hong Kong was the golden goose, because it was the economic pathway into the mainland, Beijing would not do anything to harm that or to kill the golden goose. But I think from the perspective of 2024, we have to take a very clear-eyed and look at how things transpired there. And of course, today we see the menace of Taiwan, which is deadly serious. And I think we can't have a failure of imagination about what the authorities in Beijing, especially under Xi Jinping, have in mind for Taiwan. And so this is part of the landscape and situation we find ourselves in. So as part of this authoritarian resurgence idea that came out of the mid-2000s, I would say that we have underestimated authoritarian state power. And that's not my observation. I actually had a conversation with a wonderful person who is a Belarusian dissident who I've known for many years, and I was having an informal chat with him. We were talking about what's going on in the world, how difficult it is for him and his colleagues in the fight with the gentleman who's on the screen here, Alexander Lukashenko, who has been in power in Belarus now for 30 years. And this friend and colleague of mine said, you know, we in open societies at the end of the Cold War really underestimated authoritarian state power. And I think there's something to that. And we'll get into more detail as we talk about these issues, but in a sense, the expression of authoritarian power, which can be done in a unified way, where a wide range of tools can be applied without scrutiny from legislators or independent civil society or political opposition, means that at least in the short term, maybe short to midterm, there are some advantages that authoritarian regimes have. And I think we're in the midst of that challenge now. To the extent that these authoritarian powers have engaged in democratic settings, I think democratic institutions and democratic societies are actually straining to deal with this. And more fundamentally, authoritarian powers are shaping the global landscape in ways that few anticipate. And so I'll just give one example, also happy to talk about this later. So from the perspective of the way in which the largest, what are understood to be the most influential regional or supranational rules-based institutions, so at the global level, consider the UN and all of the areas in which it's supposed to provide some sort of rules of the road for how states behave. And then regional bodies, which don't get as much attention, but there's been a lot of hope placed on, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, whose Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights were an outgrowth of the Helsinki process, was really designed to be the glue for standards on democracy, minority rights, press freedom in the OSCE space, which is North America and Europe, going all the way into big parts of Eurasia, including many countries as far as Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and the like. All of those bodies have been challenged directly by large authoritarian regimes. In the OSCE context, Russia will challenge the budgets of the special rapporteurs who work on human rights, things of this sort. They will challenge the notion that security can have anything to do with human security or democracy, and that security should only be understood as hard security. This is related to arguments that China will make in the UN context as well. But this is, I think we underestimated the ambition of the autocrats 30 years ago on what they would seek to achieve in that context. And one final observation that's more in the ideas space and the narrative space, which is that part of the expectation, certainly in free societies at the end of the Cold War, was that human rights were universal, and there were certain universal principles that we would be signed up to and at least aspire to fulfill. Part of the argument that China has made, secondarily Russia, is that there really aren't universal rights or principles, that the way we should understand the world is through ideas like civilizational diversity. So if you listen to Chinese officials speak, they'll use those terms, and in essence what it means is we all have different civilizations, and therefore we should be mindful and respectful of those, which sounds wonderful, but in the end it actually means not holding any powerful power holders to account. And this has also gotten more traction than I think one might have imagined from a quarter century ago. The image here that I'll just touch on briefly, some of you may have followed the news. This was May 2021 when a Ryanair aircraft was flying from Greece to Lithuania, and the Belarusian authorities, Belarusian air traffic control, diverted the flight to Minsk under the false pretense of a bomb threat. And they did that because there was a Belarusian journalist on the flight who they wanted to get a hold of. His name was Roman Protasevich, and they commandeered the flight. They brought it into Minsk. They took him and his then partner into detention. They treated them brutally, tortured them, held them for several years, put them on Belarusian state television to give forced confessions to their ostensible crimes, all of which were cooked up and trumped up. It's part of the playbook that's used there. And when you think about how many norms were shattered with that one act, it was really quite striking. Now, there were sanctions placed on Belarus at the time, properly so, but I think it's just an indication of the brazenness and the extent to which such regimes feel empowered to behave in ways that might have been harder to imagine from the perspective of, say, 20 or 25 years ago. And I'm happy to talk more about that case as we get into it. I'll touch briefly on this idea of authoritarian cooperation because the Belarusian case I just alluded to is widely understood to have had Russian help in commandeering the aircraft. Belarus, more broadly, is now effectively subjugated by Russia. Russian military hardware, propagandists on the ground. When the dictator Lukashenko, by all accounts, lost the election he was participating in the summer of 2020, it was actually Russia that came and provided support in a wide range of ways to help Lukashenko remain in his seat, despite the widely held understanding that he lost that election to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's now leader of the country in exile, a very impressive leader. But I show this slide because this was taken as part of the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization earlier this month in Kazakhstan. And I think what I would stress about this is when the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was more nascent, it's effectively a club of non-democratic regimes that's been expanding its membership over time, it really wasn't taken seriously. And I think it was viewed askance, and people said it's kind of a silly sort of thing. Over time, it's become a lot less silly. And it's essentially become a vehicle and an instrument, almost as an authoritarian analog to something like the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, or the Organization of American States, where they are developing their own norms. For example, they have mutual security agreements where they will, countries who participate in the SCO will return individuals who are deemed by one country to be security threats, in abrogation of refoulement standards and UN conventions. All too often, the sort of people they're returning are oppositionists or civil society activists. And so it's part of this stitching together of what I would call authoritarian norms, and this is one of the institutions through which that happens. Belarus attended the recent summit for the first time as a full member, and countries such as India, Iran, and Pakistan have recently joined the club. This, I think, speaks to the emerging phenomenon of authoritarian cooperation led but not limited to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I think if we have questions or if there's ambiguity about what's going on, we should listen to what the leaders of these countries are saying. So this quote got quite a bit of attention when it was uttered about a year ago, a little more than that. And so the quote is, "Right now there are changes the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. And we are the ones driving these changes together." And this is what Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin at the end of one of their summit meetings. You can construe what that implies as you wish. I don't think it should be construed in a too benign and friendly way. I think this is a suggestion of the ambitions that these powers have to reshape the world to their preferences, but there aren't, in a sense, too many mysteries about their ambitions, and sometimes they say these things quite directly. So let me just spend a moment just to punctuate the point of what's happening on the ground internally in many of these repressive regimes. So, as the maps I used at the beginning of the presentation show, the trajectory of respect for political rights and civil liberties has been heading in a negative direction over time. This is almost without exception the case in repressive countries where they're becoming even more repressive. So we have the example of Belarus, where as of this year there are reported to be 1,400 political prisoners. Officially, as that can be chronicled, my understanding is that number may actually be larger. In fact, in China, Human Rights Watch had identified 500,000 people being detained during crackdown on the Uyghurs. This is something that goes on. The Xinjiang region in Western China, it is not only profoundly repressive to the Uyghur community there, but China is developing, cultivating, road testing, what is widely understood to be a technological surveillance state there, which is slowly being diffused to other parts of China, and to the extent it can be, also being shared and diffused beyond China's borders. Venezuela is an example of just massive degradation of the country, both in terms of outflows of people as the repression has become more acute there, but also in terms of domestic repression and the way the population is treated. And I think what I would stress is this is a reflection of the worldview of these regimes, which are fairly entrenched and feeling emboldened. I'll just say a word about one aspect of the repression because it's so important in today's world. We have this counterintuitive, in a way contradictory reality that we live in this age of information abundance. We're saturated and overwhelmed with information. We can find anything we want if we look hard enough. We can find good information if we want, but we're often submerged in information of all kinds. Despite that, authoritarian powers have been pretty good at curating and managing information that they don't find to their liking. It's not perfect by any means. One of the great advantages of the modern information environment is that it is possible, compared to, say, the analog era, to get information to even the toughest places, with the rarest of exceptions. But authoritarian regimes have gotten pretty good at this. They intimidate, harass, imprison their own journalists, all the countries I've alluded to today. The brazenness now extends to journalists who are US passport holders, some of whom may hold a passport of these authoritarian countries as well. The Committee to Protect Journalists had a record 30-year high in 2002 of 367 journalists being imprisoned. The image here is of Evan Gershkovich, who's now been detained since 2023 in Russia on what are evidently trumped-up charges. And there are a wide list of these examples. One of the most high-profile ones in the recent past was Jason Rezaian, who was a Washington Post reporter who had been detained in Iran's notorious Evin prison for 544 days before his release. The point I would conclude with on this is that this sort of behavior, this sort of ambition does not remain in autocratic countries. And this is one of the real phenomena of our modern age and the era of globalization. And what I might describe as the reverse engineering of globalization. And so, in a sense, the autocrats have been quite good at limiting access culturally in media terms to their countries, even in an era of globalization. But at the same time, I would argue they've really defied the logic of the immediate post-Cold War era, which was that they would remain husbanded within their own borders. On the contrary, they've been able to use globalization to their advantage in ways that I'll talk about for a moment now. So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that certainly during the 1990s, the animating logic of foreign policy from certainly the transatlantic democracies was that integration globally in economic terms, cultural terms, would slowly coax along better developments in non-democratic countries, that they would modernize, that they would become more liberal, even if it would take time. And there was this idea that patient engagement would lead to reform in these settings. And it was a perfectly sensible perspective at the time, but I think it misapprehended the ambitions, the resilience of the autocrats. Because today, what we're seeing is, in many respects, that not only are the autocrats repressing their own societies, independent institutions, but they're now reaching across their borders in ways that we didn't really anticipate. And so this idea of reverse engineering globalization, if you look back at the logic of the 1970s, 1980s, the way communist polities were treating their own people, tightly controlled populations with interactions with the outside world. It was certainly true with the former Soviet Union. This suggested, by and large, that in potential eras of globalization, they really wouldn't thrive or wouldn't exploit opportunities that came there. But I think that's really not been the case, and this assumption has been challenged in quite profound ways. And if anything, in an era of hyper-globalization, the 21st century tools that these autocrats have been afforded have allowed them to take advantage of opportunities, but also some important asymmetries. So I alluded to the techno-surveillance regime that has emerged in Western China in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is also now being progressively applied in other parts of the country. We're seeing this in other parts of the world as well. So one of the best chronicled examples is in Uganda. The journalists Josh Chin and Liza Lin, who wrote a wonderful book titled Surveillance State. They're both Wall Street Journal journalists. As one of the many examples they cite as part of their work, look at what happened in Uganda, where Chinese technology, which was notionally understood at the outset to provide security, modernization, efficiency, was slowly repurposed for unexpected uses of surveillance, including against political opposition in the country. In that case, it was someone by the name of Bobby Wine. This has also been true in Serbia, in Belgrade in particular, where Huawei cameras were put in place there. And you can understand part of the importance for unintended consequences or unanticipated uses of these technologies in such settings, because you might recall last year there were mass protests on the heels of a contested election in Serbia, which were then being surveilled by Chinese installed cameras in that country. And so many of these things will be interlinked. So I'll be provocative. This is part of the argument in the most recent book we released, Defending Democracy in an Age of Sharp Power. And I think this is drawing from part of the writing that my colleagues William Dobson and Tarek Massoud undertook, that authoritarian regimes today are actually waging an active assault on democracy, both small d democrats within their own countries and borders, but also farther afield, and that in today's interconnected world, autocrats' domestic standards and behaviors don't remain neatly contained within their own borders, and this is something that open societies need to reckon with in a more purposeful and intentional way. So part of the story is the asymmetries I alluded to a short while ago. These are not exhaustive. These are a selection of some of the areas that I think are important in this asymmetrical advantage that these large authoritarian regimes have. One relates to the raw size advantage. This is surely so in China's case. Terribly important aspect of this is what we might understand as the knowledge and information spheres. And this is a much longer conversation about how the information sphere has transformed in the last quarter century, but also the way in which these large authoritarian powers seized opportunities and actually became incredibly adept in the digital age in having their ideas, views, information, and narratives find space and get traction. And then secrecy as a governance feature. This doesn't get enough scrutiny in my view, but talk a little bit about why this is important and why this is reshaping norms, in my view, at a systemic level, again, in ways that we might not have anticipated a generation ago. So on the question of size advantage, I just returned from a trip not long ago from Tbilisi, Georgia. Georgia is a country of roughly 5 million people, fantastic country, great people, democratic aspirations, have had history and engagement with Russia, for which they're quite well prepared. They understand Russia, they know how to situate the country and come to an informed conclusion on how Georgian society and Georgia should interact with Russia, even if they're having very particular challenges at the moment, given the relationship that the current ruling party in Georgia has with the Russian Federation. But historically, in the broader term, Georgia has been a country that has democratic aspirations and a very forward-leaning country, I would say. China has engaged in Georgia in a very significant way in the last several years, but when you think about it, China is a country of 1.4 billion people. When it engages, it doesn't simply engage through investment in infrastructure or technology, which it does. It engages with its propaganda apparatus, with its diplomatic apparatus, with its security services, just about every tool imaginable to advance its interests, to advance Beijing's interests. And so the idea that a country of several million, and I just use Georgia as one example, but there are many examples. I also traveled to West Africa not long ago, and there too China is deeply engaged, and I had the same strong sense that for countries that are far smaller, that may have institutional weaknesses themselves, the idea that the knowledge base and the preparation needed to deal with this superpower, in a sense, is extraordinarily challenging. And so this is a part of the story that as China has engaged globally with all of the instruments at its disposal, the initial sense that this would simply be about economic development and that it'll be, the relationship will only be based on economics, I think led to some weak preparation in many contexts. And so I have on this slide, countries can be vulnerable to the extent they aren't prepared. I think preparation is improving in a number of settings, but there's still a good deal of work to be done. And as I mentioned, China and Russia alike bring what I would describe as a full spectrum set of resources to bear when they engage, including with smaller countries. And so this is one part of the asymmetry story. The other part of the asymmetry story is this knowledge asymmetry. And so related to the size imbalances, there are typically huge imbalances between the knowledge on the ground of today's China and today's Russia once you move outside of, say, the Baltic states and Central Europe and some other parts of that geographic space. I've been jarred, maybe not entirely surprised, traveling in Latin America and, for example, or in Africa, to hear the thinness of the knowledge of today's Russia. The vision of Russia is often something maybe from 40 or 50 years ago in those settings. And that's really important because today's Russia is not the Russia operating within the Soviet context from decades ago. And so these imbalances in information effectively mean that a society can't come to an informed decision on risks and rewards of engagement. In the China context, part of the challenge is that virtually every country that has the opportunity to engage with China properly wants the economic benefits that seem to be on offer there. Whether it's technological modernization, whether it's infrastructure, it's clear, and you can't begrudge them that. From my point of view, from a democracy point of view, that's not the end of the story and the end of the discussion. And this will also lead me to the secrecy part of the discussion. It's critically important for societies to understand what they're getting into in these relationships and to understand what the potential risks are in engagement. And I would say, especially in the China context, with the promise of deep infrastructure investments or other forms of aid, to understand what the non-economic costs of economic engagement is, and typically that's very thin. Related to this challenge is that not only are these authoritarian regimes censoring and intimidating their own journalists, but they're all deeply engaged in the international media space. So it may well be that in any number of settings, the understanding of today's China or Russia may be shaped by the Russian state or the Chinese state themselves. And there are any number of countries where the dominance of media organizations or proxies operating on behalf of those countries is quite well developed, and this is very much the case in parts of Africa. So here I have a quote from a terrific sinologist. He's based in Prague in the Czech Republic. He's talking about, in large measure here, something called the United Front Work Department, which is an outward-facing instrument that the Chinese Communist Party uses. And the quote is, "Those who encounter CCP entities are not entering into a spontaneous relationship with Chinese counterparts whom they meet in person, but with a hidden yet formidable top-down bureaucracy that is beyond the ability of most people in open societies to understand because they have encountered nothing like it to serve as a point of reference." And so I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but it's just to emphasize the point that the lack of preparation, education, understanding in most societies, and it is most societies, it's the rare exception where society, in my view, is well prepared for engagement on all fronts with these large authoritarian superpowers, that this is one point that we need to internalize and take on board. So let me say a word about secrecy. This is something that my colleagues and I have been looking at more closely over time, and there is a logic to it. The bottom line reality is in all of these authoritarian systems, they operate on the basis of secrecy, among other things. But it's not the case that information is shared openly and widely in authoritarian settings. And you can think about the toughest ones, the ones that would have been the deepest of purples if there was another layer of purple, the North Koreas, the Turkmenistans, and so forth. But by and large, that's part of the ambition of these regimes, is to control, suppress information, and in a sense to have secrecy about what's really going on. And so in China's case, the approach to governance relies on surveillance and control rather than openness and deliberation, and that actually requires secrecy. And as I mentioned, to sustain it, the Chinese authorities will suppress journalism, censor digital information, and actually quite closely guard the kind of information that should be and typically is shared in open societies. But what I would stress here again is that what happens in closed societies as it relates to secrecy does not today, in an era of globalization, remain confined within these authoritarian powers' borders. And so what we're increasingly seeing, and here I just have a handful of illustrative examples. The initiative aid data at the College of William and Mary in Virginia does a terrific project looking at these things at scale and doing very rigorous work on the openness of engagements and agreements between China and their partners around the world. So I'm just using some illustrative examples to tease this out a little bit. So typically when China and its surrogates enter into agreements with foreign governments or businesses, they will require that the details of these agreements remain secret. You see this in confidential debt contracts in Latin America. You see it with respect to things like the deep space station in southern Argentina. This is an image there where my understanding from speaking to friends and colleagues in Argentina was that, as is the pattern in the lead up to this very significant agreement, there was virtually no public discussion and debate about this initiative and this investment. Argentina is an open society, it's a democracy. Nevertheless, there was virtually no discussion. This is a pattern that we're seeing across any number of examples. Russia's case, while it's not as wide-ranging and the resources available to the Russian Federation are not in the same league as China, nevertheless, when they engage in commercial activities, much of this is done in the dark. It's true in Latin America. My colleagues Ruslan Stefanov and Martin Vladimirov track these things very closely. They're Bulgaria-based political scientists, and they look very carefully at Russia's use of what has been called corrosive capital and has many of these features of secrecy wrapped around them. We did a report, my colleague Beth Curley looked into a case in Mauritius where a Safe Cities project that was undertaken with Chinese technology in Mauritius, which has, I think, about 500,000 citizens. It's a young democracy. Huawei partnered with the Mauritian police and Mauritian Telecom, but here too, the story was a story of governance process at the outset, which was shrouded in secrecy. The report that was done on this, that came out, I want to say last year or the year before last, goes into detail on how this transpired. The irony of this is, and this is true in many of these cases, because there are confidentiality clauses or features of these agreements, even after the fact, when civil society or journalists will make requests for information once the projects come to light, they won't have access to it because the authorities will invoke the secrecy clauses that are there. My understanding is this was also true in the case of China's engagement with the standard gauge railroad in Kenya, which is a massive investment there. Again, on the one hand, the transportation infrastructure, the desire to build out the infrastructure, perfectly understandable. From a democratic accountability, transparency, institutional integrity point of view, what you see is influence that's usually adverse to the more positive aspects of those things. And in that case too, my understanding is that when civil society groups and journalists have asked Kenyan officials for information, they've actually invoked the confidentiality clauses that were situated in these agreements at the outset. And one last example here, in Ecuador, there was an initiative called the ECU 911 security project. It was a technology initiative that was provided by China and Ecuador. And in the end, very little information on the front end, controversies on the back end after it was adopted, including what was understood to be surveillance of some activists there, essentially repurposing the technology for purposes that were not understood to be a part of the initial engagement. But in a sense, the non-transparency at the outset feeds into the applications of these technologies in ways that may also be adverse for democratic standards. So secrecy has emerged, in my view, as one of these values that are being diffused by these authoritarian powers over time that is now at scale. So let me say a brief word about sharp power. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but my colleagues' feeling, my feeling was, as we started to look at the expression of influence from authoritarian sources, was that the underlying idea of soft power, which is to say the attractiveness of a country's culture, its policies, its civil society, soft power being something that happened despite government and officialdom, in addition to being because of it, just didn't fit with what we were seeing, because in so many instances there were efforts to suppress expression, to sideline debate, to shape agendas in ways that were not open and candid on key issues. And hence we felt strongly that there would be a need to offer a different way to express this and find an adjective in front of the word power that might capture this a little bit better. And this is an outgrowth of this idea that authoritarian powers are essentially expressing their preferences beyond their borders in a period of globalization. And so as we got into this, and the book that we've recently released touches on this, we've done work that preceded that that also was relevant to this. There are many ways in which this influence can be exerted, and virtually all of the examples here, media, education, culture, policy outreach, technology, are things that are vehicles and resources that could exert soft power as well. If the effect were to be attraction and voluntarism, as Joseph Nye has alluded to, rather than censorship or sidelining debate. And so the underlying idea behind sharp power is that its effects lead to political censorship in the end. I'm happy to talk more about that, but in an era of globalization in which all of our systems are intertwined in ways that would have been scarcely imaginable 25 years ago, this has become a much more significant challenge, I would contend, for all of our societies. Not going to go into great detail here, but this is just laying out some of the ways China has expressed its influence more broadly over time. I know this is the font here is kind of small, but around this circle graphic are the countries, many of them open societies, in which forms of intimidation or websites being blocked or trolling has been experienced in those societies. That's been documented. This was by my former colleague Sarah Cook, who is a great expert and analyst of China. And so just to emphasize the point, in the sharp power context, the features one sees usually are associated with the monopolization of ideas, the suppression of alternative narratives, and the exploitation of partner institutions. And we see this being expressed through the knowledge sector, information and media and technology. And these are some examples from a portal that we created that actually chronicle examples of authoritarian influence internationally. And so the first example here is China's authorities seeking to reshape and actually make secret big parts of the COVID-19 outbreak, which had massive implications both in the WHO context and beyond. China flexing its muscles in the media sector in Africa, and foreign authoritarian influence in Latin America. And here too, this is a mapping of China's approaches to shaping the information landscape globally. So I'm not going to dwell on this one, but here too, the resources that are used to express influence can be used both for purposes of soft and sharp power, but its effects and its intentions, I think, are the key for understanding how this should be understood. So very briefly on some of the vulnerabilities, I don't want to suggest that these authoritarian regimes are unassailable. In the end, there are no self-correcting mechanisms in most of the examples we've touched on today. It's true in today's Russia. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, really has not solved any of these persistent, deep-seated social challenges the country has experienced really since the end of the 1990s. The governance system, this is very much the case in Russia, but I think it's true in many other such settings, rife with problems with mismanagement of public assets, extraordinary corruption, and degradation of the system's infrastructure. I think in the end, in these settings, people still want to be treated with dignity, and it's why you see people periodically expressing their frustration and coming to the streets where that can't be expressed in a meaningful way through the ballot box. And fundamentally, the ideas that might offer opportunities for officials to improve the situation are suppressed and not given oxygen in these settings, and it really makes reform very difficult. And today, it's been a pattern now for a number of months, but China is experiencing a combination of a real estate crisis, debt crisis, massive youth unemployment, and the widespread understanding is that Xi Jinping is not opening up a discussion to try to find a more meaningful way to address the challenges there. And so performance legitimacy is being challenged in China. The response in the recent past has been more repression. My guess is that we're going to see even more repression in China if they don't find a way to have the economy turn in a better direction. And so the last points I want to make have to do with the responses from democracies. I think fundamentally we need to encourage democratic unity, both within and beyond our countries, among democracies. One of the things we're seeing is that the autocrats are much more unified than they've ever been. They're cooperating. It's actually quite stunning that Russia is getting support today from North Korea, Iran, and China in a very meaningful way to wage war against Ukraine. It's just one big example. But the collaboration has grown in ways I think that we didn't quite expect. And so democracies have to find new ways to do this to safeguard their interests and values. And we need a new quality of preparation. The book that I alluded to touches on these. I'm not going to go into great detail. I would say there are opportunities to challenge the secrecy that's being exhibited and diffused globally through more potent, powerful initiatives embracing openness and transparency. I'm going to skip elite capture for now, but that's something that has also become a real challenge in many parts of the world. Defending the freedom of expression, it seems quite obvious, but today, notwithstanding the information overload we experience, in many respects it's under significant threat. It's related to, but distinct from, addressing the knowledge asymmetries I alluded to. We need to really rethink the way in which we're developing expertise within our own systems and with natural allies who can situate and understand the risks and rewards coming from these global authoritarian powers. And I would say we're behind the curve by and large in that regard. Compete in the media sphere. The large authoritarian powers have taken the competition to a very high level. The democracies are several beats behind in that regard, I would argue. And then finally, in the technological domain, democracies will need to find ways to make tech work better for democracy, and I think we have a mixed record at best to date on that front. But this is not a complete set of recommendations. I think it's still a very daunting one, but my main concluding points would be this challenge is significant. It was largely unanticipated, but fundamentally the prospects for success of systems that don't reflect the own views, reflect the views, the voices, the wishes of their own people over time will not be systems that will be on the winning side. And I think we have to work hard to make sure that that's the case. So I'll leave it there. I really thank everyone for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Chris, I want to thank you very much. That's a very thought-provoking presentation, to say the least. For all of you now, we're going to take a 30-minute break, and then we will come back for a question and answer session, which we'll do right up here on the stage. Here in the Lebanon Opera House, down at the main entrance, you will find drinks, coffee, tea, and what else, and also some sweet goodies for you to enjoy. But for those of you who are participating via YouTube, remember you can put your questions to the right of your screen. There's a chat section there, and you can submit your questions there, and we will include them in the Q&A. So please return in 30 minutes, and we'll see you then. Thank you. Back now? Can we get started? Am you hearing me? All right, good. We have a ton of questions here, far more than we could ever get to. But let me just say before we get to the Q&A, for those of you who would like to enter into a discussion of what you have heard today, there will be a session in the OSHER program's third floor. That's a 5-minute walk from here. When you go out of the front of the Lebanon Opera House, turn right, go straight down, you'll see the big sign for OSHER. Up on the third floor, there will be a special group particularly dedicated to discussing what we've heard, and that'll take place from close to noon to whenever it finishes up. It says 11:45, but we're going to go beyond 11:45 here today. So, of all the questions, Chris, I got to tell you, we'll start with this one. Can you expand on how, specifically what democracies can do to respond to this growth of authoritarianism to prevent it happening in their own countries?
So it's an important question. Are we? Oh, so should I go ahead? Yep.
Can you expand on what specifically democracies can do to help reverse the influence of authoritarianism and also do it in their own country?
So I think today the challenge is an extraordinarily complex one because the challenges are both domestic, but I would argue in this era of hyperglobalization, they're also interwoven into larger global trends. And so in a sense, it's very difficult for a given country to solve problems on its own. For example, to figure out how to use technology better, which has been among the most sweeping changes that we've experienced over certainly the last generation. There have always been technological changes from Gutenberg onward, the television. I think the speed and intimacy and customization of messaging that's come with the modern wave of technology has actually made the challenge quite difficult. On the one hand, it enables forms of organizing that are much more sophisticated, but I think there's a good deal of challenge that we're all experiencing. You can see it in my own daily life and information consumption on how you sort things out to understand the world around you, how you siphon off the things that might lead you to drift into more extreme points of view. That's much more challenging today in an era of our current era of digital revolution. So I think part of it is reclaiming in what are open societies a recognition that democracy doesn't work by osmosis and that it requires purposeful engagement. I think we've lost a bit of that in the US and other democracies. If I had $1 for every time someone has said we need to refresh civic engagement and civic education in our schools, I could probably put my kids through their own schooling. But that's a real thing. I think we've lost that over time. That requires focus from citizens and countries to say how we can restore or refresh those things. So there's no single thing I would put my finger on, but I do think the way we communicate and interact has changed profoundly in the last generation, and we have to think about ways to resituate and right purpose that so we can have real conversations, the ones that aren't necessarily enabled through the major communication platforms we have today, and then to find ways to get, among other things, our young people more engaged in public affairs. I think there's a real appetite there. I see it with my own teenage kids to be involved. I think sometimes they don't necessarily see the pathway to do that in this context. And I don't want to limit it to the US because I suspect the challenges that are emerging, in a sense globalized transnational challenges are hitting countries, different parts of Europe and elsewhere in similar ways, and we need to learn from each other on that count.
To what extent is the rise of authoritarianism depend upon individuals in terms of an individual's quest for absolute power?
So it's a difficult question because, of course, there's always a relationship between a given individual and the wider population. In authoritarian systems, the advantages that accrue to a leader who, in effect, has dominance over state instruments of power, and even today, through what might be understood as nominally private instruments, say in the commercial sphere. This has been one of the biggest, I think, defied assumptions of the post-Cold War era, is that certainly the commercial enterprises of strategic relevance in countries like China or Russia are purposed for the top political powers in those countries. They will not operate in a vacuum in a way where private companies and open societies would have far more autonomy and operate in a different way. That's a real challenge for an individual living in an already autocratized, consolidated autocracy. And those who contest those systems do it at great risk, and they should be supported. So we can see the agency of people is something that dictatorial leaders look to subtract and remove from the equation, in a sense, taking away the opportunity to vote, have a voice. Those are things in free societies that people have to routinely refresh, and certainly every individual has an obligation to do that in as affirmative a way as they can. Otherwise, it's always possible to slip, and we're seeing that in any number of settings now.
China in particular, which I would call a state dictatorship, versus Russia, which is a personal dictatorship, it seems, with Putin. But China has set forth for itself a way of capturing a democracy, and I will use the case of Hong Kong. What are the specific tools that they have used in doing away with democracy in Hong Kong, and how does that apply to the threat to other countries?
So I think it's true that Putin emerged as a personalist leader. I think increasingly it's becoming clear that that's Xi Jinping's ambition as well. Mm-hmm. And he's marginalized other figures and institutions in ways many didn't expect, including sidelining the rotation of power that the top leadership in China had brought in advance of, not long in advance of Xi Jinping's ascension to paramount power. That's now gone. He's lifted that, so essentially there's no check on his remaining in power. And Putin has demonstrated that, with the exception of that very short window from 2008 to 2012, when Dmitry Medvedev was put in effectively as a placeholder in the president's chair, Putin returned and he's there. So it's a very relevant question, I would contend, for all of us, and I've had friends and colleagues from Hong Kong, many of whom have had to leave Hong Kong since its complete subjugation, say that people in the wider world should look at Hong Kong very carefully, because that or part of it could be your future. You know, maybe that's hyperbole or an exaggeration, but I take them seriously, because as I touched on during the lecture, the assumption from the outside, by and large, was that something like that wasn't really bound to happen. That the Chinese authorities would fulfill their obligations and not abrogate the agreement they had to keep their hands off Hong Kong until 2049. Not only didn't they do that, but they've essentially sought to make and are trying to make Hong Kong, in effect, another province of the mainland, in a sense. That's clearly the ambition. The ways they did that was, they were manifold. It was a combination of ongoing propagandizing, manipulating the information space, taking over key positions in education sphere, critically, quietly seeding at scale, as I understand it, the police force, moving into the judiciary slowly. Hong Kong's judiciary was known for its independence and professionalism, certainly in comparison to the mainland. All of that was slowly drawn out over time. And one way to think about it is that, and maybe just to extend the analogy beyond Hong Kong, which was still in the sphere of Beijing's reach, unlike countries farther afield, that to the extent a local system or its institution or actors aren't prepared and don't resist when China comes in and says, we're going to run an academic program, but you're not going to talk about Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, or corruption in the Chinese Politburo. You actually need to be prepared if you're the dean of a university or an administrator to say, we welcome the engagement, mutual exchange is wonderful, this is how we learn and have cultural understanding. However, our bottom line is free expression, and we're not going to bake that sort of request in. That sort of thing was part of what inspired the sharp power idea, that we were seeing that more frequently in many places. Part of the challenge is some of that you never see, and then you're, in a sense, tasked with trying to measure and chronicle things that might not ever happen in the first place. And so part of the way you do that in university settings is to look at Chinese studies programs or initiatives that are connected to China and say, well, that's strange, they never ever talk about issue X, Y, or Z. How can that be when it's so integral to the China experience? And then, at that point you would need investigative journalists or civil society groups or others who could dig a little bit farther in order to help societies understand where their bottom line is. But I think we should take the Hong Kong experience very seriously, both for what's happened there. It's a shame, and so many wonderful people who were doing terrific work there have felt compelled to leave. So many wonderful people who are doing important work there are actually in prison for speaking the truth, in a sense, which is horrible as well for these horribly long prison sentences. But it's, in a way, an opportunity to educate ourselves and perhaps prepare a little bit more and say, these are the sorts of things. Just to give one other example, for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the extent to which the Chinese authorities reach agreements to place their own law enforcement in other countries, this happens a lot. And my sense is that it's very rare, it's on occasion where you get a blockbuster story in mainstream media. It does happen from time to time, where someone will say, big story about Chinese police in Italy, which was one of the stories. And they were tracking down dissidents or people the Chinese authorities didn't like. This is happening in a lot of places, dozens of countries, usually arranged in secret at the outset, arranged in ways that are not consistent with the law enforcement expectations and standards in the countries in which the Chinese police officials are placed. And my recollection is that this is happening across a wide range of political systems. So it's not just happening in other dictatorships, which would in a sense be a way to shore up or deepen or anchor the dictatorship in those places, which happens, but it's also happening in more open systems, which I find even more worrying for the signal it sends, for the reshaping of norms, and not least because there are examples and cases where the detention, or you can even call it abduction, of people by these officials in other countries extraterritorially has occurred, and it's almost unimaginable.
It's happened in the United States.
There were these law enforcement arrangements as well, I think even in New York City for a time, that's true. It's in a wide range of places.
How has China and Russia been trying to influence, and how successful have they been in influencing political attitudes and processes in the United States?
So it's very hard to answer those kinds of questions definitively, because in a sense you'd need public opinion data and time series data, these kinds of things. I think what's happened in the US and other open societies, Australia is a good example. There are huge controversies happening as we speak, not far north from where we're sitting now in Canada. Canada is now embroiled in what I would call a vigorous but also deeply democratic debate about the relationship it has with China. Parliamentary committees, executive branch reviews, media writing about it, civil society in the mix. It's actually the way open society should engage on these things. Australia did something similar. The US has had a somewhat similar experience. So my colleague and co-editor of the book I alluded to, Authoritarianism Goes Global, that we released in 2016, Larry Diamond, who's an amazing scholar of democracy, he actually led an effort very early on that was Stanford University, the Hoover Institution, and the Asia Society looking at China's engagement in the US and a number of other democracies. And they found, on the basis of that research, that there were this was 2017 leading into 2018, there were already a lot of worrying signs that the roots that were being grown in the US were worthy of deeper scrutiny. At a minimum, meaning that the infrastructure to communicate, the channels to communicate were there, the messages were being sent out in a variety of ways, similar to other countries where similar things were happening. The extent to which that was having effect and impact, hard to say. Part of what one can look at in this context is what I alluded to earlier, which is what isn't being said or how are agendas being reshaped. My sense is, in the larger context, and here too, I think this transcends the US, the overarching narrative over a very protracted period of time that China's engagement and ambition was principally and possibly even exclusively economic and commercial, really took hold. And to the extent that that message was being transmitted from China through its channels or through its local voices in open settings, that was quite effective, because you could hear local voices saying it, almost as if it were a talking point coming from China. So that, to the extent one agrees with that perception, that's pretty effective if most interlocutors are saying, but of course China's only here for economic benefit and mutual benefit. And of course part of it was, but the second and third part of that conversation didn't routinely happen until very recently. In part after the report that Larry Diamond and Orville Schell released, that kind of got things cooking a little bit, and then there was a mushrooming of discussion on these things, perfectly appropriate and necessary in the US context to have Americans say, well, yeah, we're happy with this part of the engagement, this is good for our economy, this is good, but you know, these other things we're learning about aren't quite right, why did we do them, should we continue doing them? That's what should be happening in democratic societies, but the second part of that didn't happen here, in my view, until late. And the second part of that has not been happening in most other places where China's already deeply engaged to the extent, in my view, it needs to, chiefly to make sure that the societies properly understand the risks and rewards in an informed way. That's crucial.
Let's see, we got through that one. We've attempted to correct some of the behavior of Russia and to a lesser extent China, but to other autocracies too, through the use of sanctions. Is that effective at all?
So they are a tool that we use frequently. I think when they're used selectively in a targeted way to the violators and criminals who deserve the sanctions, that's when they're at their best. And so I think that's been the objective and the ambition of most of the sanctions, including the ones I alluded to in the Belarusian case, the series of sanctions that have been applied to Russia over time. I think part of the challenge is that because so many sanctions have been applied, say, to Russia over a protracted period of time, the system and the narrow group of elites that know they already are sanctioned or may be sanctioned even further based on their own behavior, they've actually adapted and calibrated in a whole host of ways, whether it's hiding or moving resources or otherwise preparing. And so then the effectiveness becomes more challenging. I think relying only on sanctions is not sufficient, but it's both a signal sender, which is quite important. I think if we weren't to use sanctions and to simply let the, in Russia's case, it's the government is operating as if it's a organized criminal enterprise, and that should be properly signaled from the perspective of letting the world know that democratic governments in North America, Europe, see this a certain way, and then to the extent possible to devise them to have the greatest effect and deter. I mean, this is a big part of it. It may not necessarily stop all of the behavior that's underway, but it can have a deterrent effect.
Russia and China working together, how much of that is just to increase their own power, and how much of that is in any way coordinated attack on democracies?
So it's a terrific question. I would say at the outset, I don't think anyone knows for sure, because you'd need to be a fly on the wall of the principal decision makers in highly opaque systems that are undertaking these efforts. At the same time, we can look at what they're doing. I mean, this is, I think, a big part of our challenge right now. The overarching assumption going back a dozen years ago, when Vladimir Putin returned to the presidency after Dmitry Medvedev left the seat he was sitting in, and when Xi Jinping in that same year ascended to the top position of power in the country, I don't think people imagined that they would find a way to work so cooperatively. But with hindsight, there's an understanding that they actually started a series of meetings quite early on in their respective tenures. Putin, since he returned to power, Xi, since he ascended to paramount power in China, as well as their principal lieutenants. And so the bonds that have been formed by many accounts are much deeper than people understood. There were also, I would say, many legacy arguments that were out in the wider discussion saying Putin will never agree to be a junior partner, the historical rivalries we'll have will prevent meaningful deepening of the relationship, so forth and so on. Maybe some of that's true. I just think we need to look at what's happened in the most recent past. First and foremost, what now more and more governments in the democracies are saying, China's full-blown support for Russia's war in Ukraine. So at the outset of the full-blown war, there was a cautious take. China might help them a bit, but they don't want to harm their own reputation. They don't want to go all in with Putin because he's a losing proposition. He doesn't know how to, all these things were part of the discussion. Fast forward to today, they're supporting Russia in a variety of ways, and now there are even reports that they may start ramping up their own industrial capacity to support more directly Russia's war in Ukraine in concert with North Korea, Iran, and so forth. So I think from a position of being prudent, we need to look at this from the democracy's point of view and say, they're actually collaborating a lot more than we expected. They seem to be putting out these statements that are pretty brotherly and forward-leaning about what they're going to achieve in the coming century together, and take it seriously rather than imagining that it's not that, because they do seem to be finding ways to accommodate them, at a minimum accommodate interests in places where they used to compete, like in Central Asia, parts of the Caucasus now. One other just quick observation on this. So a number of years ago, China started an initiative in Central Europe, broadly defined, called the 16+1 initiative. Basically went from Estonia all the way down to Albania, captured both EU, NATO countries, EU, NATO hopefuls, so forth, 16 countries. For a little while, it was 17+1. Greece joined. Today, it's actually 14+1 because the Baltic states stepped out. But the idea that China would undertake that kind of initiative in that geographic space, leapfrogging Russia, and not create headaches or agita in Russia would have almost been unthinkable. But it happened, and by all accounts, they kind of accommodated each other. That effort, among other things, was really designed to divide. So it was 16+1 countries that included Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, which didn't actually operate as a bloc. So China would use this as one-on-one bilateral relationships times 16 as a way, in a sense, of dividing within the 16. It also divided the Central Europeans, however you want to define it, Northeastern Europe, Central Europe, Southeastern Europe, from Western Europe, in a sense, and then in the larger picture tried to have dividing knock-on effects Europe and the transatlantic community. And so Russia countenanced that. And I think if someone had said 30 years ago, I can imagine a future where China's going to be doing all these things in Central Europe, say, that sounds ridiculous. But there too, we can't suffer from a failure of imagination on a lot of these things. And on the cooperation issue with Russia and China, I think until we have evidence to suggest that they are tamping it down, we should believe what we see and imagine that they are going to continue to deepen the relationship, which is my guess in the absence of countervailing evidence.
You know, looking at the authoritarianism and the expanse of it, it's, you know, it looks like, okay, people are trying to build upon their power and so forth. But really, it's the very principles of democracy that are a threat to these autocracies and dictatorships. And the Chinese government actually published a document, you and I have talked about that a bit, where what the Chinese party instructed all of its senior cadres to do in attacking democracy was because of the threat of universal values of human rights, which they saw as a danger to their power, civil society, you know, particularly where people are able to make their own choices politically and otherwise, in Western journalism. All of these are direct threats to their power, not just elements of expansion. Has that been true with all of these dictatorships? I suspect so.
So the document you alluded to is known as document number 9, and it was generated very early in Xi Jinping's tenure, but only reached the public domain several years after it was initially published. And you, Bill, listed a number of the items they are not comfortable with, including constitutional systems and independent journalism, civil society. I want to say it included other things like independent legislatures. It was a very long list, but it was essentially the checklist of issues that Freedom House uses in its metrics for political rights and civil liberties. We should take that very seriously because they're domestically, under Xi Jinping, there's been an effort to stamp out whatever vestiges of those sorts of things existed. And while it's simply not possible for China or its surrogates to stamp those things out when they go overseas, to the extent the space remains for them to shape things, they will do it. And I would say while it may not be as concrete as explicit as was laid out in document number 9 in China's case, surely the most repressive regimes have most of that checklist in their sights. And I think it's important in this globalized environment, if one looks for some rationale or explanation for why there seems to be a need for the modern authoritarians to reach beyond their borders, it's because the voices of, for example, independent political figures, opposition leaders, independent civil society who had to leave their countries of origin, and there are many of them today, who are now still doing work from outside their home countries, they too present an ongoing threat. This is central to the idea of transnational repression, where these regimes reach across their own borders, try to silence others. I think it explains why there's been such a vigorous effort to suborn and subvert the central elements of universal rights in the UN context, or I alluded to the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in the OSCE context, that in a globalized world, those standards actually are relevant to the signatories in Russia, certainly in the OSCE case, and also in the case of the UN with both China and Russia. And so when international voices are using those standards and covenants to say, well, you're actually violating the rights of Uyghurs at scale, you're not permitting freedom of expression within your own borders, that there's an imperative for these regimes to reach out to both contend that there is no such thing as universal rights, that this is a concoction of the West, which is not true, or you're missing the boat on what we should really be focused on, which is mutual respect and civilizational diversity, which sounds wonderful, nothing to argue with, but in terms of human rights law and actually respecting the right of the individual, those kinds of things only go so far. And it allows the freedom, in a sense, for those regimes to do as they wish within their own borders. And so I think in an age of globalization, they're working very hard to reduce, minimize, and possibly even eradicate the stigma that's been associated with authoritarian governance, in earnest since the end of the Cold War, when the vision was, well, we're going to keep moving in a direction of greater respect for human rights and democratic accountability and freedom of expression. I think they're actually very purposeful in their public arguments and behaviors as a way to, in essence, land closer to their preferences. The only way you counteract that is by having purpose and a strategy of your own to respond.
And that's going to come to the next question. I know your organization focuses on abroad, but there are so many questions I got today that extend perhaps domestically that I have to ask a few of them. One of them is, it seems that democratic societies invite authoritarian intrusion unconsciously. True or false?
It's a great question. I think we all, I would say, especially in this era of customized media, we all need to be vigilant, and we're all susceptible to one degree or another, to arguments that our well-being will be best safeguarded by maximizing security, for example. So this is one of that we give up our freedoms for security. And of course, there's a balance with these things in every context, but I think free societies have prospered and are, the data bears it out, are the places that deliver best for their citizens over time. It's where people seek to move. You can look, people vote with their feet in a sense, and so people are not moving at scale from one hard place in earnest to the Russian Federation. They're not even moving to China. They're not going to Egypt. They're not going to Venezuela. They're in the main leaving those places to come to more open, more prosperous settings. So we know this, but at the same time, the lure of simple answers, the lure of ostensible quick fixes to things, it's part of human nature, and we have to guard against it, especially in systems that are open, where we have free debate. You know, there are ways to reach people, I would say especially today, in a highly customized way. And not to terrify people more, but you know, in an age of generative AI, the ability to scale and customize messages with speed is going to increase, absent the regulations and rules and norms that are needed to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think, what's the expression? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I think in a sense, yes, we need to really take that on board, not imagine like the world will always be like the 1990s. We already know it isn't. That was an unusual, that was, I think George Will called it the holiday from history, like that period of time. And in a sense, you know, that was misleading for many people. They think, oh, this is great, you know. And we know from, from the 15 to 20 years most recently, like the holiday's been over, so we have to get back to work.
This question has been asked by about 6 different people. Let me see how I can paraphrase it. It seems that if you declare that the head of state is immune from any law, that you're headed toward autocracy.
Is it a rhetorical question?
Don't we have a problem here?
So I would answer the question in institutional terms. I think what we're seeing globally right now is a beefing up of executive power in so many settings, and not just in settings that, you know, if we go back on the map a while, that were already autocratic. So this is a trend in any number of places, and I think for all of us, we need to be extremely vigilant and mindful as early as we're able to make sure that meaningful checks are there for our power holders. I don't want my power holders to have unbridled power. I don't want any dominant power holder to have that. I think it makes sense on so many levels to make sure that the checks are there in a meaningful way, and you know that.
Is there a lesson for us to pay attention to and to learn in terms of what has happened in Hungary and Turkey?
So in Hungary, I think one of the lessons is there were signs early on that could have elicited more purposeful responses earlier in some of those efforts. But it's an interesting case, I'm saying the efforts of Viktor Orban and Fidesz to create a stronger hold on the system in that country, which is the view of many observers who watch Hungary closely, including but not limited to the media space there, which is a little bit different because Hungary is, I want to say it's 8 or 9 million population, very tough language, and the Hungarian language media was in many ways, independent voices in that media space was suppressed pretty systematically over time. And so then it was people in the country who had languages beyond Hungarian that had the opportunity to look for widely diverse views in the information space, which is still possible. I think some of the decision makers in Europe, Hungary's a NATO and European Union member, couldn't quite figure out the levers to pull early on to get maybe a slowing down of some of the efforts to prune some of the institutions in the country. but it's an exceedingly difficult challenge. But what I would say is the resilience of society, even in Hungary, where there were very large protests and some figures that are not aligned with the dominant powers there, have been competing well, I think, in the Budapest mayoralty. And likewise in the Turkish case, I think there's still enormous dynamism in the society, which is a very young one, which is pushing up against the what I think many Turkish citizens might see as executive overreach.
I'd like to offer you the opportunity to make a wrap-up statement, if you would care to.
I'm not sure what else I can say. I think I'd first of all thank everyone here for not only coming out in the heat, but sitting through the discussion. I think these kinds of discussions, not necessarily this topic in particular, but the topics that the OSHER lecture and others like it take up are really important for the country and for our society, and we need more of it. We need more discussion among Americans that are designed so that we can listen to each other, and so just appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I think I would encourage everyone to speak to their friends and family members about the need to have the U.S. engaged in the world. I think the idea that we wouldn't be engaged in the world when the world is engaging us in ways that I've described, but far beyond that, I just think is not a winning solution for the U.S. And we have so much to offer, both as a society. I think our values and principles remain valued by so many people around the world, even if our country is in a tough spot right now, and even if people are feeling uneasy about things. The reality is I travel a lot, and people really do look to the U.S. They respect the U.S. And in a way, I think the fact that we may be having our own challenges is an opportunity for other countries to say, we're all in this together, and I think we are, in a sense. Small d Democrats are all in this together, and that just calls for us to work even harder and find ways to innovate. When the going gets tough, we've got to work harder. The sitting it out or stepping back is not the answer or the solution, so I would leave it on that note.
Good. Thank you very much, Chris, for a superb performance.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for the questions.
And a reminder, if there is a discussion group in the OSHER building at 1 Court Street, go out the front door, turn right, walk for about 5 minutes, and you'll see the building, 3rd floor.